Hello, and welcome to another episode of QuickIP. Today, we'll be focusing on copyright limitations and exceptions. And as usual, we take off from our timeline or map of various stops. Remember, we started with subsistence of copyright. We talked about work, the fact that there has to be a work and the work has to be original, fixed in a material form, authored by a qualified person. We talked about the exclusive rights, economic rights and moral rights. And then we went to step 2, where we talked about authorship, and we said it's defined in relation to each category of work or each category of protectable subject matter. We went to authorship and we talked about the general rule that the author is the owner of copyright in the work, except where the exceptions apply. And we delved into the exceptions. We went to step 4, where we dealt with transfer and acquisition of copyrights through licenses, assignments, testamentary disposition. And we went to step 5, which is infringement, where we dealt with remedies, infringement itself, remedies, and defenses. And today we deal with step 6, where we talk about limitations and exceptions to copyright protection. When we spoke of copyright infringements and remedies, we also spoke of defenses to infringements. And in talking of defenses, we mentioned copyright exceptions and limitations as one of the concepts that serve as defenses to copyright infringement. So copyright, now when it comes to copyright limitations and exceptions, or copyright exceptions and limitations, there are 2 ways of looking at it, and both ways are equally important. The first aspect is, like I said, copyright limitations and exceptions can serve as defenses to copyright infringement. So say someone is sued for copyright infringement or someone is accused of copyright infringement, they could offer copyright exceptions and limitations where applicable or where relevant as a defense to copyright infringement. But they also, copyright infringement exceptions and limitations also serve as policy implementation tools. So the second approach is to look at it from the perspective of various policy considerations in arriving at exceptions and limitations, because exceptions and limitations serve these purposes, other purposes besides providing a defense to an allegation of copyright infringement. So for this QuickIP, our focus is on limitations and exceptions, but from the perspective of going beyond defenses to copyright infringement to asking what are the justifications for any given exception or limitations. What is the rationale? What are the purposes? What are the purposes do you want the limitations and exceptions to serve beyond just offering a defense to copyright infringement? Because some limitations and exceptions can be justified on more than one ground or more than one rationale. And, various countries vary quite substantially in the number and types of limitations and exceptions that they give in their laws. But what underlies these limitations and exceptions in various copyright statutes are discernible justification that you can point at and say, this is what this exception and limitation is supposed to serve. These are the policies that you want to use these exceptions and limitations to promote, to implement, and to have going on in your specific society. So let's look at some of them a little bit in depth. So policy justifications. The first one is that you could have limitations and exceptions. You use them to promote ongoing authorship. You could also use them to protect private property interest. You could also use them to promote public interest benefits like access to knowledge, access to information, education, providing, education and learning materials. You could also use them to promote competition. We'll deal with some of these justifications subsequently. So let's start with promoting ongoing authorship. One purpose of limitations and exceptions is to promote ongoing authorship. And as mentioned in previous episodes of QuickIP, one of the fundamental concepts in copyright law is authorship, which is basically the process of creating a protectable work. And remember that we talked of authorship in relation to various categories of protectable subject matter. In order to create a work, one would need to use other works, like other pre-existing works. And this use of other pre-existing works would be in varying degrees and for various purposes. And so you have limitations and exceptions that allow others to quote from pre-existing works. That's why you have this quotation marks. Because when you're writing your assignments, when you get to your final year, or when you're writing an essay or dissertation, or when you're quoting from a given work, you are allowed, there's that exception, there's that limitation, copyright protection, that allows you to quote, and you use the quotation marks to indicate that it's a quote, and you indicate the source that you are quoting from. Also, in many jurisdictions, you could also have limitations and exceptions labeled as fair dealing for purposes of private study, where someone is, you buy a book, you are using this work, that you've borrowed or you've collected or that you've seen or that you've had access to just for purposes of private study. You want to study, like you do with your textbook. You could also have there are also limitations and exceptions, also labeled as fair dealing or fair use, depending on the jurisdiction, that allows for commentaries and criticism of existing work, for you to, say this work is fantastic, and you get to say, looking at various aspects of the work, you say, this is why I say this work is fantastic, or this is why I say this work requires improvement in this area and in that area, and so on and so forth. You could also have another goal or another a policy that you want to implement, which can be to protect private property interests. So limitations and exceptions can provide a shield, for personal property interests or private property interest. And one example of this is the one that relates to, where you can lend or sell or generally share with people works that you've already purchased, that you own the physical copy. So you have, as students, you could use your textbook for in a particular year, and then you're done with that year, you sell that textbook. You are allowed to do so because you have private property interest, and copyright protection does not extend to that. So, which means there's that exception that allows you to do that. You could also have, when we're talking about one of the economic rights, you would see that they regulate public performances, communication to the public, distribution of works to the public, and so on and so forth. So within the scope of exclusive rights, you will find that private performances, private communication, private distribution, they are not covered. So if you're going to use a sound recording in a house party, for example, it's not covered by the scope of exclusive rights. That means you're allowed to do so without incurring copyright infringement. There's also an example that relates to limitations and exceptions that allow people who have purchased computer programs to make backup copies, or to adapt the program in a way that allows them to use what they purchased. You could also use limitations and exceptions to promote public interest benefits. And a good example is using limitations and exceptions to promote access to information, to promote freedom of speech, to promote freedom of expression, participation in culture. So an example of using limitations and exceptions to promote access to information and freedom of speech and exception and all that, you find that there are limitations and exceptions that could permit use of copyright protected work for purposes of news reporting on current events. There are some limitations and exceptions that exempt political speeches from copyright protection. So these kinds of exemptions serve for promoting access to information, because when you are engaged in providing access to information, those exceptions that we just mentioned will allow you to use copyright works without incurring copyright infringement liability. So that's why speeches at political campaigns, for example, they are in some jurisdictions they are not protected from copyright infringement, or even if they are protected, it will be in a different form, but people can comment on those speeches, and no one can, on the basis of copyright protection, prevent them from doing so. Another public interest benefits that you could use exceptions and limitations to promote is to increase participation in education and learning. And one example is limitations and exceptions that allow the use of copyright protected materials in the course of teaching for purposes of illustration. You have limitations and exceptions that allow libraries and archives to produce works, so purposes of preserving them. You could have limitations and exceptions that allow copyright works to be made into an accessible format copy so that people with print disabilities can have access to copyright protected works. So those kinds of exceptions serve, social policy goals. Another way that you could use exceptions to promote public interest benefits is the one that deals with accomplishing economic goals, fostering competition and ongoing innovation. So think about this picture that we have here, sneak preview. You find that in many jurisdictions, you could have limitations and exceptions that allow stores that sell sound recording, stores that sell television units, for example, to play music in the case of sound recording, to play, snippets or preview of those music to help customers to decide whether to buy them. You could have those that sell televisions units. They could share snippets of broadcast that allow people to see, display the broadcast so that people can see the TV and how it works and all that, and they get to make a decision to then buy the television. You could also find in the literary world, even though there's no good example I can think of now of specific exceptions that covers what you have, similar to what we have with sound recording. But you find that sometimes publishers allow people to have access to the first chapter of a work or the introduction of a book or some preview, just so that people can see what the work covers and people can make a decision as to whether to buy the books. Think, for example, Google Scholar or Google Books, not Google Scholar, Google Books, where you see books, you get to read the introduction, you get to read some sneak preview of the book, and then you decide whether to buy the book or not. You decide whether the book is relevant for your purposes or not. There are also exceptions and limitations that allow public institutions to function. So I think, for example, you have legislative tests, court judgments, reports by government agencies, and all those kind of things that are not covered by copyright. So because of that, public institutions are better able to function because they have access to those materials without concerns of copyright infringement. The final thing I wanted to touch on is there's this debate currently going on in many jurisdictions, including in Africa, and especially in South Africa, regarding whether we are to move from fair dealing exception, which has what we call a closed list of exceptions, because under fair dealing, they just mention specific activities that are considered to be fair dealing, or whether we should stay there or move to fair use. That is usually considered more open-ended, because it allows more activities that do not need to be listed specifically. The thing is that the arguments on both sides are quite persuasive. But what is important for our purposes here is to think of these specific justifications and uses and purposes of copyright limitations and exceptions. Because for each country, what you do is you think of those justifications and purposes of copyright limitations and exceptions, and then you will decide in adopting or providing for specific limitations and exceptions. What do you want to achieve? What do you want to achieve in a specific context, bearing in mind the exclusive rights, bearing in mind your international obligations? Once the country is clear on what it wants to achieve, once a country is clear on what it wants to achieve, then it becomes easier to select or to come up with limitations and exceptions that will serve those specific purposes. So whenever to round off, whenever we think of copyright limitations and exceptions, we have to always remember that they serve as defenses, copyright infringement, no problem, but they also can be used as tools to implement certain policies. So if you decide that you want to, for example, promote education, learning, and all that, then you would be more particular about the kind of limitations and exceptions that you provide, for libraries, the kind of limitations that you provide for educational institutions or for educational purposes, and so on and so forth. So we will stop here and say that's it for now. See you in class, and bye.